The photograph was small, black and white, and yet it carried a weight that seemed almost physical. The kind of weight that presses against the chest and leaves a chill behind the ribs. A bride and groom, both smiling, posed in rigid formality. Their clothes were ordinary for 1938, a lace gown, a wool suit. But their faces told another story. Identical, not merely siblings, not merely twins, a perfect mirror of one another. And in that reflection lay the first whisper of a curse that would stretch across generations. The town of Merrin, in the northern reaches of Vermont, had long whispered of the Merrins. Wealthy, reclusive, silent as the snow that drifted against the mountainside each winter. Outsiders spoke in hushed tones when the estate's name arose. The children, never seen in sunlight, were said to be delicate, prone to strange illnesses. The adults, distant and precise, seemed to inhabit a world apart. One ruled not by the ordinary passage of time, but by some older rhythm, older than memory, older than the land itself. No one remembered the first twin marriage. It had occurred quietly in 1893, in the chapel Wilhelm Merrin had built from stone hauled by his own hands. No townsfolk attended. No records were kept. Only the family journals, bound in black leather and kept under lock and key, held the proof. Within those pages, a covenant was written. The firstborn son must marry his twin sister, a bond of purity, sanctified not by the state or church, but by blood and by fear. Wilhelm Merrin had come from the fog-enshrouded valleys of Bavaria, where superstition and piety intertwined so tightly that a breath out of place could invite ruin. He brought with him the leather-bound book that would dictate the lives of every Merrin for decades to come. The journal spoke of divine perfection, of souls split in twinship, and the sacred duty of keeping the blood untainted by outsiders. To Wilhelm, the outside world was a sickness. He had arrived not for freedom, but preservation. Preservation at a cost that would become grotesque over time. In 1938, the photograph was taken. The world outside would never know the story it captured. A mirror of innocence concealing horror, a smiling visage masking centuries of secrecy. Behind the walls of the estate, rituals continued. Children were measured, observed, even whispered to in ways that made their minds shiver with instruction before they could understand. The covenant was not merely law, it was fate, and fate demanded obedience. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? By the time the children were old enough to speak, they already carried the weight of a history they did not understand. The estate was a fortress of stone and shadow, its hallways echoing with whispered admonitions, its windows shuttered against the outside world. They learned early that the wind outside was cold, yes, but that the air inside could chill the soul more deeply. Playmates were forbidden. Letters from beyond the mountains were rare, burned unread, or dismissed as poison. Curiosity itself was a crime, and obedience was sanctified by fear. A strange child was born in the winter of 1942, the first of a new generation, the midwife. A woman whose face had grown tight with dread over the years of service to the Merrins would speak of the birth only in fragments. She described how the infant opened its eyes and fixed her with a gaze that felt ancient, intelligent, and wary. The child moved with a precision that was unsettling, bending limbs too fluidly, twisting its tiny head to follow sounds no one else noticed. The parents watched with a reverence that bordered on terror, as if this child were not theirs, but the vessel of something older, something woven into the stone walls themselves. The child grew under strict supervision. Lessons were conducted in hushed tones: history, mathematics, scripture. And genealogical records filled the hours, but always the same lesson beneath the lesson. The world beyond these walls was corrupt, dangerous, unworthy. And yet, the most important lesson was never spoken. It was observed. The child learned that love belonged only to its mirror, that every affection, every bond, every whisper of joy must ultimately bend toward the covenant. Brothers to sisters, sisters to brothers. A line folded upon itself, generation after generation, until identity itself became a blur, a reflection that one could not escape. Strange rituals were observed in the dead of night. Candles burned in a spiral along the floors of the private chapel. Symbols were traced in ink and wax, some of them unfamiliar, ancient, written in languages older than the family itself. Occasionally, the child would hear noises that did not belong to human throats. Screams that seemed to come from within the walls, from rooms long sealed, from children who had never left their cradles. Sometimes a body would appear, small and twisted, carried through hallways and set into darkened rooms, to await an end no one dared speak aloud. The estate breathed with a life of its own, and the child learned to navigate its shifting shadows, following the rules of a world both intimate and monstrous. Visitors were rare, outsiders who wandered near the estate, tradesmen, surveyors, or the curious, often reported an unease they could not name. Windows were dark, doors bolted, and even the sound of laughter, when it occurred, seemed wrong. Behind closed doors, the family practiced what the patriarch had promised: purity. Faith twisted into ritual, love twisted into obligation, innocence twisted into horror. And yet, for all the care taken, cracks began to form. Children were frail. Limbs bent unnaturally. Eyes flickered with madness or fear. The covenant, meant to preserve perfection, had begun to manifest the opposite. Each generation suffered, yet none understood that suffering was not proof of divine favor, but of decay. The Merrin's obsession with purity had become its own predator, and the child, growing ever more aware, felt the first tremors of doubt stir beneath the stone floors. By adolescence, the child had become both student and prisoner, their body and mind a ledger of the family's meticulous devotion to the covenant. Each day was a repetition of lessons, of rituals, of careful observation. The walls themselves seemed alive, whispering reminders of obedience, the hum of centuries pressing through stone and timber. Shadows elongated along the corridors as the child moved, and at night, the house exhaled a cold breath that carried the scent of wax, dust, and decay. Strange symbols were etched into hidden corners of the estate, the residue of forgotten ceremonies. The child discovered them one afternoon, scratching at the plaster with fingernails, until the patterns became clear. Intertwined twins, circles within circles, a labyrinth of inevitability. Occasionally, a servant would glance their way, eyes avoiding, lips tight with warning. Sometimes an elder whispered, almost in prayer, that the child was the vessel of destiny. And so the child began to understand, in a way words could not convey, that life itself within the estate was not measured by years, but by the covenant. The older siblings and cousins were similarly molded. Some grew pale and silent, their laughter hollow, their movements jerky. Others, brighter in mind yet frail in body, became the architects of the family's strict order, enforcing rules their own youth had never questioned. Every meal, every lesson, every act of affection reinforced the bond of twinship. Friendships with outsiders were forbidden. Curiosity about the outside world punished by long, unspoken terrors. The estate itself became a mirror for the family's obsession, corridors looping endlessly, staircases that led nowhere, locked rooms whose keys were entrusted only to the patriarch. Night brought its own terrors. Screams sometimes erupted from the locked upper floors, sharp and sudden, slicing through the thick winter air. The child would lie awake, listening to the echoes, to the shuffling of feet, to whispered prayers that sounded more like incantations. Some nights, the child swore they saw fleeting faces, pressed against the window's pale, twisted, children who had been born and hidden away, their lives a silent testament to the cost of obedience. The Merrins did not mourn, they celebrated survival, perfection, purity, and yet the evidence of imperfection was impossible to ignore. Limbs bent unnaturally, minds clouded, eyes hollow, the bloodline was both honored and punished in equal measure. Occasionally, a visitor arrived, a physician, a tradesman, a stranger brave or foolish enough to cross the gate. They saw nothing outwardly disturbing, only the polished floors, the quiet halls, the carefully composed children. But the eyes of the child betrayed the truth. Knowledge that the world outside could not penetrate, that the family's devotion to its own laws had birthed something unnatural, terrifying, and inescapable. And then the child began to notice patterns in the adults themselves. Their mother, her face pale and drawn, would trace the same gestures she had learned as a girl. Her eyes sometimes reflected something else, fear, reverence, or madness. Their father spoke to the shadows in the corners, consulting voices no one else could hear. The child realized, slowly and with growing dread, that these were not mere eccentricities, but the echo of generations of obsession. The covenant was alive in them, a living, breathing force that demanded obedience above all else. By the time the child reached the threshold of adulthood, the estate had become a labyrinth of dread and expectation. Each hallway carried the weight of centuries, each door a threshold into the hidden histories of the family. The journals, bound in black leather and locked with iron clasps, had become their silent companions. They contained genealogies, meticulous records of births and deaths, detailed annotations on deformities, and instructions that dictated not just marriage, but thought itself. To read them was to witness the covenant's relentless logic unfold across generations, a creeping pattern that bent reality into its will. The child, now older, taller, their gaze sharper, began to perceive the full scope of what the covenant demanded. Every firstborn son, every firstborn daughter, every union of twins was not choice but decree. The family line was folded in upon itself, a Mubius strip of flesh and obligation, each generation pressed tightly against the one before it. Children were raised not with affection, but with careful instruction. Eyes were observed, features measured, temperaments recorded. The family's obsession with perfection was methodical, almost surgical, and yet horrifying in its devotion. In the dead of winter, the estate seemed to pulse with a rhythm all its own. The wind outside cut across the mountains like a knife, yet inside, the air remained heavy, almost viscous. Footsteps echoed through corridors lined with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow the living. Some nights, the child would wake to find the servants standing in corners, silent, motionless, witnesses to rituals they could not comprehend. Candles were lit in spirals on the floors, symbols drawn in ink, wax, and sometimes blood, the faint metallic scent lingering, even after the flames were extinguished. Whispers began to seep into the child's consciousness. Shadows on the walls took shape, twisted, half-formed figures. Children who had never survived or had been hidden from sunlight their entire lives. The cries from the upper floors, previously distant and abstract, became intimate, threading their way into the child's sleep. The covenant demanded more than obedience. It demanded participation in the architecture of its own horror. The family was both architect and victim, creator and creature, locked within a cycle they could neither resist nor escape. It was in these years that the child first glimpsed the grotesque cost of the Merrin's devotion. Limbs bent unnaturally, eyes clouded with madness, faces twisted into permanent masks of reverence or suffering. Children were hidden behind locked doors, sometimes for months or years. Their lives carefully catalogued and observed, but rarely spoken of. The elders regarded these children as proof of sanctity, their deformities a testament to the success of isolation and bloodline preservation. Yet to the child, the horror was unmistakable. Perfection had become a weapon against life itself. And then came the realization that would haunt every waking hour. This was not merely a family tradition. It was a doctrine of control, an edifice of madness passed down over centuries. Every act, every word, every ritual was designed to reinforce the covenant, to entangle flesh and mind until nothing remained outside its grasp. The child's own body, own thoughts, own affections were already bound. They understood that they were living in a house built not of stone alone, but of obsession, secrecy, and fear. The revelation came slowly, like a shadow unfurling across the walls of the estate. The child began to trace the lineage in the family journals, page by page, generation by generation, noting the patterns that repeated with uncanny precision. Faces mirrored one another, names folded back upon themselves. Unions that should have been forbidden instead celebrated as destiny. And then, finally, the truth, shocking, grotesque, undeniable. Every firstborn son married his twin sister. The covenant was not simply preservation of blood, it was incest. Sanctioned, sanctified, and repeated for nearly a century. The weight of understanding pressed against the child's chest, suffocating in its intensity. This knowledge reframed everything: the whispered prayers, the locked doors, the hidden children, the deformities. Each act of obedience, each ritualistic ceremony, had been designed to perpetuate this twisted mandate. The estate itself, its stone walls and turrets, its locked windows and hidden chambers, was a monument to the covenant. Every echo in the hallways, every candlelit spiral, every shadow that moved independently of its source had been a warning, a reminder, a part of the machinery that bound the family to its own nightmare. The parents, once figures of authority and protection, became instruments of horror. They spoke of love, duty, and destiny. But beneath the veneer of devotion lay something darker: fear, reverence, and unshakable obedience. Each sibling learned the covenant from birth, memorizing the instructions, as if they were scripture. Childhood was a rehearsal for inevitability. Play became preparation. Affection was a lesson in loyalty to the bloodline. And as the child grew, they realized that the family's so-called perfection had been bought with suffering, manipulation, and the slow decay of flesh and mind. In the upper floors of the manor, the hidden children, those too weak or deformed to walk freely among the living, remained locked away. Their cries, their muttered syllables, and their fleeting, terrified movements became part of the fabric of the estate. The child saw them through small cracks in the doors, glimpsed their twisted forms, and felt the inevitability of the covenant pressing upon their own life. To survive was not merely to live, it was to obey, to continue the cycle, to accept the horror as sacred. Yet, even as the covenant's logic tightened like a noose, cracks appeared. Doubt whispered in corners, in empty hallways, in the child's own thoughts. Questions that had been forbidden surfaced with insistent urgency. What if this is not destiny? What if it is madness? What if the world beyond the gates, beyond the snow-laden forests, holds truths far larger than the manor's walls. The child, now fully aware of the covenant's grotesque design, began to look beyond obedience. Curiosity, the one trait punished most severely, became a dangerous weapon. The first seeds of rebellion took root in silence. Small, careful observations, hidden glances at the journals, questions whispered to shadows. Each step forward was a risk. Each step, if discovered, could bring punishment unimaginable. But with the horror of understanding came clarity. The covenant, the tradition, the ritual, could be undone, but only with knowledge, courage, and the perilous defiance of everything the family had taught for generations. By the time the child reached late adolescence, the estate had become both cage and crucible. Every corridor seemed to hum with the weight of centuries. Every portrait a silent judge of loyalty. The family's rituals had evolved into something almost clinical, each motion precise, each act recorded in journals that smelled of wax, leather, and dust. And yet, despite the meticulous control, a fragile thread of rebellion began to weave itself into the child's mind. Knowledge had become a weapon, and observation a means of survival. The child began to study the hidden texts, the journals that had once seemed merely ancestral pride. Line after line, they traced the genealogy, noting the deformities, the illnesses, the children who had vanished into the locked upper floors. For the first time, it became impossible to deny that the covenant had cost the family more than obedience. It had cost their humanity. They discovered passages written in dense German and Latin, describing rituals older than any living memory, intended to preserve perfection. But the perfection had decayed, twisted into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. Late nights were spent in secret, poring over discarded pages, observing patterns invisible to those who still believed. The child began to understand how isolation compounded frailty, how each twin marriage, each repeated union, magnified weaknesses hidden deep within the bloodline. Faces of cousins, siblings, and ancestors emerged as warnings, etched into time itself. What the family had called sacred was slowly revealed as self-destruction disguised as devotion. In the shadows of the estate, whispers became voices. The servants, long silenced by fear, sometimes left hints, a glance, a gesture, a discarded key. The child began to map the hidden chambers of the house, the locked upper floors where infirmity and madness were concealed. Behind those doors lay the consequences of obedience, children who had never walked in sunlight, whose faces bore the subtle deformities of generations pressed together, who had grown accustomed to shadows as their only companions. The child realized that the covenant had never been about divine favor. It had been about control, about erasing choice and bending flesh to an ideology older than the estate itself. And then came the question that would not leave them: could the cycle be broken? Could they defy the covenant without destroying themselves in the attempt? Each day became a balance of observation and concealment, knowledge and survival. They studied the patterns of the elders, the rhythms of rituals, and the timing of meals and walks, until the estate itself seemed like a clockwork of obedience. The child was no longer innocent, no longer naivete. Their mind had become a ledger, recording everything: the deformities, the marriages, the hidden deaths, the hidden screams. Each piece of knowledge was a stepping stone toward defiance. And as the snow pressed against the manor's windows, a silent understanding took root. If the covenant was to end, it would take courage, cunning, and the cooperation of those bound most closely to it. Only then could the house, the curse, and the legacy of decades of twisted devotion finally be confronted, and perhaps, finally, undone. The turning point arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly. One winter evening, when the wind howled against the stone walls, like the voices of ancestors warning of betrayal. The child, now a young adult, moved silently through the manor, tracing the familiar corridors with a purpose sharpened by years of observation. Each footfall was measured, each breath controlled, as though the walls themselves could hear the faintest sound of rebellion. In the hidden study, beneath dust and shadows, they discovered evidence that would become their compass. Old journals, sealed in iron locks for decades, contained photographs, sketches, and notes that detailed deformities, early deaths, and the meticulous breeding of twins. Some pages were stained with the faint brown of old blood, others annotated with precise measurements of limbs, skulls, and eyes. Names repeated in a grotesque litany, each generation folding into the next, each child a reflection of the one before. It was not faith that had guided the family for nearly a century, but obsession. Obsession, and a fear so absolute that questioning it had been punishable by confinement, by madness, or worse. For the first time, the young adult truly understood the scale of the horror. The covenant was more than a family law. It was a system of control, perfected over generations, an architecture of obedience written into the flesh and mind of every child born within those walls. They saw the deformities not as divine marks, but as evidence of the covenant's cruelty. They saw the deaths not as sacrifice, but as consequence. And they realized that escape required more than stealth. It required convincing another to see the truth, to share the risk of defiance. Their twin sibling, who had been raised with the same rituals, the same devotion, remained a figure of faith and fear. Convincing them would be the hardest battle yet. Years of indoctrination had been stitched into their very bones the covenant, the purity, the sanctity of twin unions. Any attempt to speak against it could shatter not only the siblings' mind, but the fragile alliance that might save them both. Yet without that alliance, the cycle could never end. The manor itself seemed to conspire with the child's resolve. Hidden staircases, locked doors, forgotten passages became tools rather than barriers. Nights were spent planning, observing, memorizing the routines of elders whose fanaticism had grown brittle with age. They noted every detail. The hours when the patriarch retired to his study, the times the gates were left unattended, the sequences of meals, rituals, and inspections. Each observation was catalogued in secrecy, a map of opportunity born from centuries of oppression. And still, fear lingered. The cries from the upper floors, the shadows in the corridors, the faint smell of candle wax mixed with decay, all reminded them of what was at stake. One mistake, one misstep, could undo years of careful preparation. Yet the young adult's resolve hardened. The covenant, the legacy of generations of cruelty, would not continue unchallenged. The bloodline had been folded in on itself for too long. And now, it was time to tear open the ledger of family history and confront the horrors it concealed. The collapse of the covenant did not arrive with ceremony. It came like rot finally breaking through wood, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. When the truth began to surface, it did not spread through shouting or headlines, but through whispered phone calls, sealed envelopes, and doors closed too quickly. The estate, once untouchable, became a sight of dread. Men entered carrying notebooks and flashlights. Women followed with clipped voices and eyes, trained not to linger too long on what they found. Behind locked doors, the architecture of obedience was laid bare, rooms with restraints bolted into bed frames, cabinets filled with handwritten ledgers, cataloging births that had never been registered and deaths that had never been reported. Photographs of children whose faces carried the unmistakable symmetry of twins, repeated too many times, generation after generation, until individuality itself seemed erased. In the upper floors, the investigators found what the family had hidden for decades: evidence of lives lived entirely in shadow, of suffering reframed as sanctity. The town reacted not with outrage, but with fear. Church leaders met behind closed doors. Officials spoke in careful language. The Merrins had employed too many, funded too much, owned too much land for the truth to be allowed to breathe freely. Animals were slaughtered and buried. Records disappeared. Fires broke out where no fire should have been. What could not be denied was quietly destroyed. What could not be destroyed was buried beneath euphemism and silence. Within months, the estate was emptied. The family name vanished from public mention as if erased by collective agreement. No trials were public. No sermons named the sin. The house itself was marked for demolition, its stone walls reduced to rubble under grey skies. Where the chapel once stood, nothing remained but disturbed earth and the memory of candles burned in spirals meant to sanctify horror. The covenant did not end with justice. It ended with erasure. Years passed, decades, and yet fragments survived. In the late 1980s, a researcher studying genetic isolation in rural American families came across a set of photographs, mislabeled, in a university archive. Identical faces, wedding attire, the same eyes repeating across decades. The deeper the researcher dug, the stranger the absences became. Missing birth certificates, cemetery plots without names, journals referenced in inventories but no longer present. It was as if an entire bloodline had been deliberately scrubbed from history. The researcher followed the trail to old maps, fire reports, and testimony given under sealed conditions. What emerged was not a single crime, but a system. A family that had transformed fear into doctrine and obedience into destiny. The Merrins were no longer alive, but their legacy lingered in the margins of records, in the gaps where truth should have been. And the more the researcher uncovered, the clearer one thing became. The covenant had not ended because it was exposed. It ended because someone inside it chose to stop it. What remained of the covenant survived only in fragments. A recorded interview sealed in an academic archive. A handful of photographs that never made sense to anyone who found them. A family tree that looped back on itself, so tightly it appeared less like history and more like a wound that refused to close. The researcher listened to the tapes late at night, alone, headphones pressed tight, as a voice spoke calmly about things no human life was meant to contain. The voice never asked for sympathy. It did not seek absolution. It only spoke because silence had already killed too many. The account ended without resolution. No righteous punishment, no divine reckoning, just escape, disappearance, and the long aftermath of survival. The twins were given new names, new documents, new places to exist. They were instructed never to return, never to speak publicly, never to reclaim the land that had shaped them. The world called it protection. In truth, it was exile. Freedom arrived stripped of identity, history severed like a limb. One of them withdrew from the world entirely. Never married, never allowed anyone close enough to trace the outlines of their past. They worked quietly, lived sparsely, and avoided mirrors whenever possible. Reflections carried too much memory. The other tried to build something resembling a normal life, though the word itself felt foreign. They married outside the bloodline, an act that once would have been considered heresy. Before having a child, they sought medical certainty, desperate to know whether the covenant had carved something permanent into their blood. The tests showed damage, but not destiny. The cycle, it seemed, had finally been broken. Still, the dreams never stopped. The manor returned in sleep, intact and breathing, its corridors endless, its candles still burning. Voices whispered through the walls, calling names that no longer existed. In those dreams, the covenant was not dead. It was waiting. Not for continuation, but for remembrance. Because what the family had built was not just a tradition, but a warning. The land where the estate once stood is quiet now. Houses built atop foundations that were never meant to hold ordinary lives. Children play where rituals once unfolded. Dogs run across ground that once absorbed secrets too heavy for stone to bear. No marker tells them what lies beneath. No plaque warns them what was erased to make room for silence. But history does not require monuments to survive. It lives in what was hidden, what was denied, what was allowed to persist, because it wore the mask of faith and family. The covenant ended not because it was condemned, but because someone born into it chose defiance over obedience, chose truth over destiny, chose to end a bloodline rather than preserve a lie. And now, with the photographs fading and the records burned, the question lingers, quiet and unresolved, carried forward not by the Merrins, but by anyone willing to listen. What would you do if you discovered that the person you were meant to marry, the person you were taught to love, the person called your destiny, was also your sister? The archives do not catalogue what followed. There are no official conclusions, no tidy resolutions stamped into record books. What survived did so unevenly, like bones unearthed long after the soil had forgotten the shape of the body. A few photographs misplaced in filing drawers, a transcript mislabeled and ignored, a family name spoken once too often in a university basement, and then never again. What the covenant left behind was not a lineage, but an absence. Those who escaped carried it in quieter ways. In the way sleep never came easily. In the way mirrors felt accusatory. In the way intimacy carried an unspoken terror, as though closeness itself might summon the past back into the room. The covenant had trained them too well. Even freedom felt like a violation of some ancient law written into their marrow. The house was gone, but it still existed in memory, every corridor intact, every door locked exactly as before. In dreams, it was never ruined. The candles were always burning. The journals always waited to be opened again. The covenant, stripped of power but not presence, lingered like a reflex the body never unlearns. History prefers villains who are easy to name. Monsters with sharp edges and obvious crimes. The Merrins offered none of that. They were orderly, devout, respectable. Their horror wore inheritance like a sacrament and called obedience virtue. No single generation invented the crime. Each merely refused to stop it. And that is how it survived so long. Blood does not remember morality. It remembers repetition. It remembers permission. It remembers silence. Somewhere, long after the estate was reduced to rubble, a child asked why a family name no longer appeared in local records. The question went unanswered. Silence, after all, had always been the most faithful guardian of the truth. But silence is not the same as erasure, because every so often, someone finds the photograph. The one with the identical faces, the wedding clothes, the smiles that never quite reach the eyes, and for reasons they can't explain, they feel something cold settle behind the ribs, a recognition without memory, a warning without words. Not all curses demand belief to survive. Some only require that no one stops them. And one day, finally, someone did.